preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
I am supposed to talk to you about who and what is an American Jewish novelist. I think you were told I would be talking about who and what is an American Jewish novelist. And to start off this series of three discussions on this topic, which would seem in itself a little bit limited, I decided that one way of attacking it was to acknowledge that as far as who is concerned, I can just say for one for sure is me. And what I will try to explain to you. And if I succeed in doing this in this session, I can then transfer myself to other subjects, other writers in the next two sessions. But I want to say from the outset that I do not speak as an academician. I am not a scholar. I am a novelist, although in one book I did attempt with Charles Angoff to do an anthology of American Jewish novelists, and so I've read, I suppose, most of the material, but you can always come up with some book that I haven't read and floor me. And you can ask me why I didn't include this or that, and we'll go into that in the next two sessions. Now, why I claim to be an American Jewish novelist, or even a Jewish novelist, may enlighten you on some of the area that concerns all of us who write about Jews in America. As you know, some of the most prominent who write largely about Jews in America have declared themselves to be American novelists and not American Jewish novelists. We'll go into them in another session to see just what they may mean for themselves and what they mean for the public by making that distinction. But I want to go, first of all, into the formation which should give us the best idea of what is an American Jewish novelist. Now, most of us, I think practically all of us, at this time and for the last 20 or 30 years, who use material of American Jewish life in our novels or stories or plays, are people born in America who went to school in the routine way in American public schools, and perhaps some of them later in particular high schools, or in a few instances in Jewish schools like Chaim Potok, specializing in Jewish material, but for the most part received an American education, meaning that American and English-derived literature was what we were brought up with, what we studied, literature of the English language, and we were using the English language, so that we were formed in a culture that was distinct, complete, rich, and counter to what might later on appear to us as partly, or more importantly, our own culture. That is, it would take for most American, most future American writers, it would take probably a period through their emergence from high school or even from college to begin to find themselves and to differentiate themselves from the culture in which they had been saturated through their education, and from the language, of course, which they used. Now, this problem has been recognized by Jewish writers in other cultures a long time before us. In other words, we have very recently an article by a leading French writer, a member of the Academy, Joseph Cassel. Now, Cassel was born in Russia, raised in South America, I was startled to learn, and came to France at about the age of 10. And then, of course, became completely absorbed in French culture, although he is one of those who has been a very active Jew who has never tried to disguise or to in any way gloss over his being as a Jew, and who has been interested in Jewish life and Jewish problems. Nevertheless, in this article, in a French Jewish magazine a few months ago, he wrote on this very problem and said, what am I? I am a French writer. Why? Chiefly by question of language. A writer lives through, his work is concerned with the culture and the expression that comes to him with language. And unless I were writing in a Jewish language, unless I had retained Yiddish or learned Hebrew as my mode of expression, I must be a French writer. Now, I have somewhat of a different attitude about the language problem, although it is very, very troublesome to one who later on decides that there has been some kind of a mistake, that he is a Jew, but he is using another language. The same problem came to us about 3 weeks ago, I think, in an article in the New York Times Sunday magazine by the poet Joseph Brodsky. Now, Brodsky didn't really enter into the question of Jewish content in his writing. Nevertheless, it was apparent all through the article how this troubled him. And he too began by saying, basically, it's a question of language. I'm a writer. Russian is my language. It will always be my language. I am now confronted with a terrible problem of adjusting myself as an exile to life outside of Russia in a country using another language. And I don't know how I'm going to go on because everything in me is in Russian. Now, on the Jewish side, there were some interesting things because, first of all, he was, of course, imprisoned and received most of his difficulties, his trouble, in an antagonistic attitude toward Jewish writers that persists ever since the destruction of the cream of the Jewish writers of Russia in the last years of Stalin. But throughout this article, I noticed that he kept using biblical images. Again and again, instead of using images from Russian history or from Russian literature to illustrate his points, he slipped into images taken from the Bible, so that he too must have a very powerful residue of Jewish culture in conflict with his Russian culture, and now in conflict with his living in exile in America. And then the poem that was cited in the article was a poem using classical Greek material for its subject. So how he is going to work it out, I don't know. But I can tell you what happened to me as a perhaps extreme example of what is considered by my contemporaries as my too-Jewishness, or my unfortunate reversion to Jewish nationalism, some of them call it, or to a destructive absorption in Jewish material when I should have kept up with material of American life. Now, how I came to specialize as I do, and what I encountered in the process, I will relate to you because I have just finished rereading, and it's fresh in my mind, an autobiography that I published 20 years ago called In Search, which is entirely, in fact, the first sentence begins, the first page begins on this problem with the words, "This is a book about being a Jew." So then it goes on to say it's also a book about being a writer and a Jew. I didn't need so much this refreshment, but I was surprised as I read through this, because I was just correcting it because at long last it's going to be republished and be available again. I was surprised at how completely all that I had to say on this subject 22 years ago applies to today and is being rediscovered today by some of our present generation American Jewish writers, such as Herb Gold, who has just published an autobiography identifying himself spiritually and consciously that the greatest factor in his life is that he is a Jew. Now, that doesn't mean that he, like poor Meyer Levin, is going to go and lose himself by writing books about Israel, but it's just a little more company. I found in my generation that trying to write about Jews was a difficulty professionally. And perhaps because I began to encounter this difficulty, being a stubborn-necked, stiff-necked personality through my heritage, I was turned more and more in that direction. Also, there was the axiom that we all encounter when we begin writing from our teachers: write about what you know about. What I knew about was, of course, the West Side upbringing in Chicago. Now, there's another point to make here. Virtually the most important trend in modern literature, in the novel particularly, is autobiographical. We all recognize that. But it's autobiographical, usually dealing with the youth, the childhood and youth and perhaps early manhood of the author, sometimes done very directly, sometimes transformed into various removes of fictional forms. But nevertheless, as we read it, we always feel, well, we're going to learn something about this person's life, the man who wrote it. We're going to really see his own experiences transformed and transcribed. Now, this even has a generic name in German, the Entwicklungsroman. In other words, the novel in which the character and the lifestyle of the person and the background from which he springs unwinds, is unfolded. And this, I think you will find, is the dominant tradition in all of the modern novel of our time. There are, of course, purely imaginative novels, historical novels, such as one that I've just written, idea novels, and so on, observation novels. But if you take, by and large, the stream of modern literature, it's characterized by that. It's characterized by that, if you use the German word for Entwicklungsroman, by Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks itself. And it's characterized by that in the great English novelists and in the early American novelists who were my contemporaries, and it goes on to this day. Now, the Entwicklungsroman, therefore, almost imposed on the young American Jew who wanted to write the use of his background. At the same time, when I began, this was out of favor. Now, at that very time, a few classics in American Jewish literature were created. And so now when we look back, we think, oh, well, if the rise of David Levinsky and Mike Gold's Jews Without Money and Roth's Call It Sleep were written during that period, then it must have been fine to be a Jewish writer. Look at these works that were created. But these are, of course, exceptional works that lasted because of quality. What we encountered as we began to write was that, first of all, magazines didn't buy or weren't likely to buy stories with Jewish characters. It was simply a professional thing that you learned right away. And so many Jewish writers would change the names and the backgrounds of their characters and put them in that kind of never, never American world where a Dr. Schwartz became a Dr. Dudley and so on. And then you had some chance of selling. Now, there was one kind of fiction about Jews that, again, is contrary to what I'm saying, and that was in demand. That was the Fannie Hurst image. Fannie Hurst was writing sentimental stories about the Jewish Talmudist who sat in the doorway of his shop while his wife was behind the counter and the son was in the back practicing the violin. These things were accepted as the prevalent image of the Jew, and these, because she had become a popular writer, found no difficulty. But there was a kind of a numerous clauses, let us say, which you very soon learned not to buck. There was also a resistance among book publishers, and young novelists were kind of turned off of going into Jewish material. Now, I found this out in various ways fairly soon, and then it became very specific. I'm going to first of all, it became specific in that in my earliest novels, I tried to avoid the Jewish background. I wrote a book called Reporter, which was just a kind of a documentary fiction of a reporter's daily work and how it flowed into his personal life. There it was true that the reporter himself was presented as a Jew, but it was a very, very minor factor in the novel. And I had a hard time getting a publisher. It took about 3 years, but finally it was published. It was accepted together with my second novel, so that they were published in series. And in the second novel, I really tried to eliminate the Jewish quality. It was called Frankie and Johnny, and I wanted to present a really American novel based on the Frankie and Johnny song, a bit of American folklore, and transmute it into the city life of a couple of young romantic kids who were in love. And so I called it Frankie and Johnny, and I was using, of course, American Jewish characters. I was using people I knew. But the names were bland, non-ethnic names, and the background, instead of being Chicago's West Side, was the South Side, which later on became James Farrell territory, where sort of it was mostly Irish that lived. And so I wrote this thing feeling all the time that maybe I was doing something wrong, wrong from a literary point of view. Maybe I was suppressing qualities and atmosphere that should be there. Nevertheless, that little novel did come off very well, received some pretty high praise, sold very little, and it was only after this novel that I encountered a very strong feeling of my connection with Jewish material by an odd circumstance. First of all, I should say that my earliest serious publication was in, oddly enough, the commentary of that time, a magazine called the Menorah Journal, a high-quality literary magazine, and that they published a sketch I wrote about the Jewish West Side and a socialist soapbox orator and the people listening, who were dreaming of the future utopian world, but then realized with a shock that tomorrow morning they had to go to work in the shop. That was about the extent of it, but it was very much the background that I later used in the Old Bunch. So that I did, even in college, begin to have these feelings that my field was to write about what I knew. Well, I went abroad right after graduation from college, and in a wander year, I wandered as far as Palestine. Through this connection with the Menorah Journal, they knew I was wandering around the Mediterranean, seeing Greece, and so the editor suggested, well, if you're that close to Palestine, Why don't you go over and cover the opening of the Hebrew University? So I had really the unusual shock, let us say, for an American Jewish writer of that time, of encountering the Palestinian movement, the Yishuv, the kibbutzniks. All of this was new, fresh. We hadn't heard about it at all here. I didn't know the first thing about the Zionist movement or anything. And this had an enormous effect of turning me. So that from then on, I suppose I've been a Jewish writer, or an American Jewish writer, or whatever you want. Now, I returned. I did a novel a few years later about life in a kibbutz. I think it was the first one. And at the same time, another accident happened. When I stopped in Paris, I had a friend whom I had also encountered through the Menorah Journal, an artist in Paris named Meyer Schwartz. He used to tell Hasidic stories. And he had a little collection in his studio of Meise Bichlach, little pamphlet-sized things in Yiddish that were folk stories about the Baal Shem Tov and also the stories of the grandson, Rabbi Nachman. And I became fascinated by this material. Now, my Jewish education had been virtually nil. I'd been sent to a cheder. I knew a few words of Hebrew. I could read the alphabet and so on. But I had never encountered the actual life material. And this really was as much of a surprise to me as what I had just seen in Palestine, so that it became the second leg, so to speak. In Palestine, I had seen as one leg of my future balance, I had seen the future of the Jew, the new Jew. Here in the Hasidic material, I encountered what was for me a very direct link to the not so far distant past and the culture of the Yiddish-speaking world in Europe, in the Carpathian region. My third leg, so to speak, was my American upbringing and the Jewish background of the West Side. And the result was to be an effort to harmonize and to use all this as a writer. Now, the first difficulty came not so much with these two books. One was called The Golden Mountain and was a collection of Hasidic tales redone for the first time into English. And the other was Yehuda, a novel about Israel. Neither of them made any impact whatsoever. But I did get them published without much difficulty because they were about foreign background, Jews abroad. But then I attempted my big novel, The Old Bunch, in the early 30s, and I encountered the resistance we had in those days, which is hard for people to understand now because Jewish material is supposed to be very highly valued in the publishing world, and anyone who writes a Jewish book is supposed to have an immediate bestseller. But in those days, we had this kind of taboo. So that while I had embarked on this long and difficult novel with a little contract from a publisher, and knowing and having told him that this was going to be about young Jews growing up, getting into their pattern in life, once I had finished it, his reaction was, well, this is an excellent work of literature, but don't you think you ought to change it to a melting pot street corner group? Don't you think it would be more typically American if these 15, 20 kids were comprised of some Poles, some Irish, some Italian? In those days, they didn't add a few Negroes, as they would today. But in any case, he wanted a melting pot story with, of course, one or two Jews included. I just couldn't see it because it simply wasn't true. What is now being recognized as the ethnic residue in American cultures at that time was denied. people said, oh, no, everybody's getting mixed in together. Today, of course, the current has turned the other way very recently. But my novel was in what would be the current of today. And so he rejected the novel. Well, I was, of course, terribly disturbed by this. And I started trying to find another publisher. In not too long a time, I found a better publisher, the Viking Press, with a higher literary standard. And they didn't require it to be changed. They published it as it was. And it was a kind of a breakthrough. Many of today's Jewish writers who are in a younger generation than I, people like Norman Mailer, will tell me that the old bunch was the generating force for them, that they felt from it that one could be free, really, to write about what one really knew in this country. Of course, Mailer hasn't gone very far with that. He had a few Jews in one novel and Schluss. But nevertheless, I keep being told that by younger writers, that it had the effect for them that they really could use Jewish material. Well, the book did mildly well. It took many, many years before it established itself as a sort of a permanent book on American Jewish life. But the same difficulty arose with my next book. Now, this was not particularly a book of Jewish background. In the 30s, of course, we all were very much engaged in the revolution. Everybody was an activist, and I was an activist in Chicago during the Republic Steel strike, in which 10 strikers were killed by the police, and as it turned out, shot from behind. Well, they were already running away. Now, I continued one of the characters from the old bunch, a doctor, made him the doctor who was there to help the strikers, as I had been with a friend of mine, a Jewish doctor. And around him was strung the story of the whole strike and the 10 lives of the people, only one of whom was a Jew, who were killed. It was a cross-section. That was the real melting pot story. There was a Negro, there was a Jew, there was a German, there were Poles. It was a real cross-section of American society. And so I told the life story of each one and wove it into the story of the strike. It was called Citizens. Now, when I got finished with this novel, the same publisher, Viking Press, who had published my breakthrough novel on the Jewish scene, called me in, and he was a good German Jew, Mr. Ginsberg, and he said, Meyer, we can make of this novel another Grapes of Wrath. They had just before, the season before, published Grapes of Wrath, a great, great bestseller and a wonderful book. And so he gave me this line. This was an industrial Grapes of Wrath, and they could make it just as big a bestseller. But he only had one little idea to suggest. Instead of a Jewish doctor helping the strikers, couldn't it be a non-Jewish doctor? Like, say, a Swede. Well, you know, it was a very great temptation. After all, this was not a novel about this doctor. It was a novel about the strike. But the doctor at the scene had been a Jew. And in any scene of that kind, the doctor would most likely be a Jew. It was typical for America that the doctor would be a Jew. I even went to work for a few days and tried transforming this doctor and giving up his connection and continuation from the old bunch and making him a Swede. Well, it even worked. I mean, the editor, a man named Zabludowski, who had been my editor on the old bunch, said, well, you can do it. You're doing it. But after about 50 pages, I just couldn't go on. That is ridiculous. And so I went back and said, I'm just very sorry, but, you know, whether you make it a great bestseller or not, I hope you will, but it has to stay a Jewish doctor. But I'm bringing this out because as late as 1938, there was this kind of difficulty and hesitancy and blockage in writing about Jews. Now, what was this in this instance? In this instance, it was no longer, as I felt, an honest repression. In other words, the publisher didn't really feel that leaving this Jewish doctor in there would hurt the sales of the book because people didn't want to read about Jewish doctors or whatever. He was a member of high Jewish establishment, German Jewish establishment, which at that time, and perhaps even today, is concerned with reducing the profile of the Jew. Don't make ourselves too conspicuous. Don't present a radicalizing Jewish doctor. And from his personal status in the Jewish community, and since he happened to be my publisher, he thought, well, here's a chance to erase an instance of this kind from a novel, so I'll get Levin to change it from a Jew to a non-Jew. Well, he didn't. But you have to consider all through this difficult period that you were encountering a taboo that had many sources, that in some instances the taboo came from the non-Jewish world that didn't want to feed the public and didn't believe the public would respond to stories about Jewish life particularly, and so they were quite honestly saying in the magazines, we can't overload with Jewish material. On the other hand, there were these Jews, whom we still have with us, saying, let's not have too much written about the Jew. Well, I survived that one. The book came out. It didn't do very well because the war began at that time, although people still tell me it's the outstanding labor novel of the period. And I then encountered the war. Now, in compulsion, I'm getting ahead of the thing. In Citizens, I had been writing as an American Jewish writer, an American writer principally because this was an American story. So that to examine, in my example, what is an American Jewish writer, it is not necessarily someone who confines himself totally to the Jewish theme. I've done books that are considered simply American novels. I've done books that are American Jewish novels, and I've done books that are simply Jewish novels. What was developing in me was a sense of seeking my personal orientation. In other words, I had it described, and it's described in this novel, in this autobiography, In Search, quite a bit earlier. One evening on 8th Street in the Village, when I had returned from my third trip to Palestine. I think it was in the riots of 1929 that I was there, my last living period in the kibbutz of Yagur, and I had been there during the riots. And even there, a crisis of identity emerged because I was still connected as a reporter with the Chicago Daily News. When these troubles began, I knew that as a reporter who was still sending back feature stories and what, I should go and cover the riots. Nevertheless, I'd been living in this kibbutz sort of as a trial member or as a chaver, and to leave at the moment when it was in danger of attack seemed the wrong thing to do. So I stayed on until the danger had passed. I stood on guard one night with a piece of iron pipe. I think we had 2 revolvers in the whole kibbutz. But there already was a what are you thing. Are you an American reporter first, or are you a Jew living in this kibbutz first? When I returned after writing the novel Yehuda, I remember one evening walking with a fellow writer down 8th Street in the Village and bringing up this whole question, and I touched on the very problem with which I started this discussion, language. I said, look, if I am a Jewish writer and I feel more and more my contact with the Jewish past, the Jewish material, then my necessary pattern would be to go and live in Palestine, to learn the Hebrew language well enough to write in it. That would be a unified context of being a Jew, just as it had been for the young Jewish writers who came from Russia a generation before. But to them, Hebrew, of course, was already virtually a learned language, and the revival of Hebrew was part of their task. To me, Hebrew was a totally strange tongue and not an easy one for me to assimilate. I never have really learned it well. So that as a young writer who had just done his third novel, I felt this is an impossibility for me. I cannot stop and learn to write in Hebrew. I'll never be able to conquer the language, just as Mr. Kessel said he couldn't write in anything but French, just as Brodsky tells us that Russian is his language. And so my language is English, and I must proceed as a writer in the English tongue. Now it brings the question, writing in what is not necessarily a Jewish language, neither Hebrew nor Yiddish, can you be a Jewish writer? And of course it has been done in other languages by other writers all through our history. So that in approaching Jewish material, I felt what really is required to be a Jewish writer is more knowledge of Judaism, more knowledge of Jewish life, and I feel personally more and more attracted to it. In other words, I am strongly attracted to what's going on in Palestine. And the next great attraction or negative attraction, you might say, came with the outbreak of the war and with the question of what was happening to the Jews of Europe. This was, for me, a very decisive turning point. It was just after I had published this American novel, Citizens, but I stopped writing for the period of the war. I stopped writing novels. I returned to journalism, and I was motivated and driven, as it were, with a need to know what really was happening to the Jews in Europe, because, as many of you remember, it was impossible to know. We had these rumors of the death camps, the crematoria, but the persistent counter story was that this might only be atrocity propaganda created by the Allies. And actually, until I got to Europe with the troops as a war correspondent, I wasn't sure in my own mind whether this thing was true or not. And so for the duration of the war, I worked for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency and an overseas news agency that was associated with them on the Jewish story. And it became my task. I spearheaded, oddly enough, with the tanks of a General Abrams, he who has just been made chief of staff. He was then a spearhead tank commander in the Patton Army. And he was the first to reach into the heart of Germany, into the area of the death camps. And so I had the dubious distinction of being sometimes the first one to enter one of these camps. And there I began to meet the survivors and to get their stories, and for a time I did nothing but try to collect names. And I became absorbed in the European story, the Jewish story, the story of Jewish fate. And I suppose I have followed it ever since, because it seemed to me not only that it connected within me to something far deeper historically in my roots, but also that it was more important than anything I could do as just another American writer. I felt that there were plenty of talented novelists in this country who would be writing about the American scene and the American problems. And this is not the kind of a choice you make coldly or deliberately. It was just a choice that happened within me, that here was a body of material that perhaps would not be told about in a way that I could tell to the, first of all, American Jewish population, to connect them with what had happened in Europe, and to the world population, to the American reading public as a whole. So that from then on, I have worked principally in Jewish material and tried to stabilize my cultural background with further reading and contact and study of Jewish history and Jewish life. In other words, it seemed to me as I grew more and more into maturity that my American upbringing and American education and education in American and English literature was an accident, that my proper material, the one that rang more truly in me, that connected far deeper into the past, was the material of Jewish life. And so I am one of those, and we are, I feel, fairly few, who has concentrated in trying to bring that life alive again when it's in the past, or trying to unify what happened in Europe, what's happening in Israel, and what's happening to the Jews of this country into a single pattern so that we could see our way to the whole problem of assimilation or continuity through knowledge rather than through accident. Now, in doing this, I found myself encountering a new opposition, if you want, or obstacle that for a long time wasn't very clear. I knew I was having difficulties, but how specific they were and what their roots were, I didn't learn until around 1952, and it has been with me ever since. Now, some of you may have read recently in the New York Times an ad that I published, a half-page ad at considerable cost, which is being paid for by some extra lectures this season, about the difficulties of the silent treatment on the settlers, and generalized by the question, can a literary mafia affect your choice of books? And what I pointed out was that there is a politicalized literary mafia in this country, which has attained a very strong positional hold in the literary establishment, so that they have people spotted around in secondary or tertiary positions in all the book reviews and the magazines, and even in contact with programs on the air. And as Podhoretz described in his book, Making It, they call each other up. They pass the word along on books that are coming up, on what to say, which to praise, which to kill, and to which to give the silent treatment. And I said that my trouble with the silent treatment on the settlers, which is demonstrable, it hasn't been reviewed in a single national magazine. I mentioned Time, Life, Newsweek, but I can add, and in the Saturday Review, and I can add Harper's, Atlantic, the New Yorker. All of these magazines have reviewed virtually all of my books in the past. Suddenly on The Settlers, which is generally acknowledged in newspaper reviews to be my best book, there is not one word in any of the magazines. Now, it's the magazine review that, of course, establishes your status. The newspaper review passes good or bad, but it falls into the stream of stuff. But it's the repetition of reviews on a book that finally creates in the public an atmosphere of this is worthwhile, this is literary, this is not, and so on. So that the silent treatment is a very, very important thing and very hard to recognize. In fact, it took me some months to recognize it. Now, the same silent treatment, if you read the New York Times again in the past few weeks, has been described by Solzhenitsyn, by Brodsky, and in an article of George Orwell's, discovered, of course, posthumously, which was to have been the preface for Animal Farm, in which he described word for word my position. Continuous literary denigration on one hand, ending up in the silent treatment, difficulty of getting published, all of these things together. Now, where does this root back to? In the ad, I could only give the barest description, because space is quite expensive. It roots back to 1952, and even a little further, but it's easily demonstrable by some examples from 1952. Now, I was by then tagged in radical circles, let's say communist, Stalinist rather, as a Jewish nationalist author because of my autobiography, which came out in 1948, and which, incidentally, I couldn't get published. I was, that time, the author of The Old Bunch, which was already established as a kind of a classic. I was the author of Citizens. I had published just a little before that My Father's House. And suddenly, on this autobiography, which is about to be republished, I couldn't get a publisher. I finally wound up publishing at my own expense in Paris. And that's the edition that I'm working from. Eventually, a very, very small publisher put out an edition here, and that disappeared very quickly. Why couldn't I get it published? It was too much on the Jewish theme, it seemed, too Jewish and too emphatic about the whole question of Jewish identity. And even then, the radical bunch was using their contacts in the establishment against me. As a matter of fact, there was one very clear incident. I found one publisher, Crown, in the States. I was living in Paris. I came over to get a publisher. And on virtually the last week of my stay, Nat Bartels accepted the book, and his chief editor came down, and we had a great love session with great praise for this book, and it was going to be published. And I went down in the elevator, and in the elevator, I met a sales representative of this firm, whom I recognized as having known some years before when I worked in Chicago on Esquire. And this man, then working for another firm, had come through and got us to organize a union on Esquire, and we'd all been fired as Reds. Well, it turned out that it was a Red union. In any case, we shouldn't have been fired, but even if it was a Red union, but we got fired. Well, this fellow was in the elevator, now working for Crown. He said to me, "Oh, Meyer, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Oh, you're going to do my autobiography." He said, "Oh, great, I'll read it over the weekend." And so he read it over the weekend, and on Monday, the owner of the firm, Nat Bartel, called me up and said, "Listen, you'll think I'm a rat, but I have to renege. I can't do a book that my sales manager doesn't want to push." And so the fix had been put in there by a Stalinist. So I was on their list. Came 1952 in the Diary of Anne Frank. Some of you have heard a little about this. I referred to it in the ad, but I want to give you an exact example of what I'm talking about being a Jewish writer. As is fairly well known, I had more or less brought the diary over from France, helped find a publisher here, got a review onto the front page of the New York Times, and was the chief talker on radio and television and everything promoting the book. All this time I had been trying to convince producers that there should be a play and a film of this thing, and everybody had said no. But now that it was a bestseller, they said yes. So I wrote the play. It was accepted by Charles Crawford. We brought over Otto Frank to make sure that the production would be accurate and the atmosphere correct. And he hadn't been here more than 2 weeks when I was called in by Miss Crawford and told that her good friend Lillian Hellman had read the play, and that she now realized that she had lost contact with it, and that Hellman insisted that there had to be another writer. It simply could not be the way I had done it. I was a novelist and not a playwright. It was unactable. It was this and it was that. There had to be another writer. Well, I got one chance to try to get another producer, and Herman Shumlin accepted my play at once. And they said, "Oh, Shumlin will never produce a hit again. We can't have him." Of course, his next production was Inherit the Wind, one of the greatest hits ever. But this is the kind of shenanigans that started. Well, I suspected right away that what was wrong was not me, but the Jewish content of the diary. There was nothing in my play, of course, that was not in the diary as far as Jewish content was concerned. And it took about 3 years before they got some non-Jews to write another version, and they produced it. It became a great hit on Broadway, and when I saw it, my suspicions were confirmed, and some of the serious critics said the same things. They were confirmed internally from the evidence of the play, what they had done with it. Now, it boils down to several examples, and I want to read you the most important. The diary contains one passage, which is a kind of an affirmation of faith by Anne Frank. Like many of the things that I dramatized, and they later dramatized some of them, this had to be put into dialogue and put into some kind of a conflict situation, which I did, but I retained the actual words, which I'm going to read you. Now this, mind you, began in 1952. 1952 was when we learned that Stalin had murdered the cream of the Jewish writers, some 22 murdered, sent to concentration camps. It all came out with Khrushchev's famous speech. But it was the time when it was taking place, when the policy against Jewish culture in the Soviet Union, the strangling, had begun in a very, very aggressive and active fashion. And it's not to be supposed that followers of the same ideology elsewhere didn't have the same point about Jewish material, such as Lillian Hellman. Now here's the passage from the diary. Who has made us Jews different from all other people? Who has allowed us to suffer so terribly up till now? It is God that has made us as we are, but it will be God, too, who will raise us up again. If we bear all this suffering, and if there are still Jews left when it is over, then Jews, instead of being doomed, will be held up as an example. Who knows? It might even be our religion from which the world and all peoples learn good. And for that reason, and that reason alone, do we suffer now. We can never become just Netherlanders or just English or just representatives of any other country for that matter. We will always remain Jews, but we want to, too. Now, whether you agree with her religious interpretation or not, this passage, I think, summarizes the mystique of the Holocaust, the whole question of God and the 6 million, more perfectly than anything else that has been written, whether in entire books or not. It was, to me, what is called a must-scene, a scene that no dramatist could leave out of a dramatization of the Diary of Anne Frank. And so, of course, I had included it. In the Broadway version, eventually produced in a play written by the Hacketts under the tutelage of Lillian Hellman, and she had picked them for the job, there's a scene completely parallel to the one in which I use this passage. And what they put in her mouth is this: we're not the only people that have had to suffer. There have always been people that have had to. Sometimes one race, sometimes another. Do you recognize Bobby Yar? This was the exact line. It's not the Jews that were killed. We don't have to identify them especially. There is no special significance to their being Jews. Nothing. Over this, I have fought for about 20 years. Over this fight, I attracted the antagonism of this whole clique because it doesn't include only Stalinists. Today, there is one point on which the Stalinists, the Maoists, the Trotskyites, and all the other factions are united virtually, and that is they are anti-Israel to a very great degree, and the Jews in those movements are assimilationists. They're the Lillian Hellmans. So that as long as I fought for the Jewish point of view and for the right to produce my version of the diary, and eventually it was produced illegally several times this very year at Brandeis University, as long as I tried to expose this problem, they attacked me little by smears, by gradually closing down on the attention given to my books, by literary denigration, shrugging me off as not really a literary person at all, but a popular writer, and by silence. From their crowd, articles about American Jewish writers, bowing down always before Bellow and Roth and so on, would include maybe 20 or 30 names, but you never saw the name of Meyer Levin included, even in commentary. This long, slow, silent campaign had begun. It showed itself up so prominently on the settlers that I bought this ad to try to bring it to public attention. For not only was The Settlers notably unreviewed in all the magazines, but all the talk shows that I had been accustomed to being on in the New York area, not in the rest of the country, but in the New York area, I have been absolutely shut out. I have not been on either of the Barrys, Barry Gray or Barry Farber, or any of the other usual shows that you spread a word about your book. I was always welcome on these shows. Suddenly, absolute silence, sometimes a feeble put-off. We'll schedule you a little later. We just had a book about Israel or stuff like that. Now, how does this come about? There is one more contact I want to give you, and then I will see if we have a little time for questions. Working at Doubleday, at the time of this whole crisis over the diary of Anne Frank, were a young pair. They were not yet married. She was then named Barbara Epstein, and he was Barbara Zimmerman, and he was Jason Epstein. Barbara Zimmerman was working with me very closely on the diary because her first job had been to edit it. And I very frankly told her when it came time to select a producer for the play, because then we had several applications, I very frankly said, I don't want it to get into the hands of the commie crowd because they will distort or minimize the Jewish content, which of course is exactly what happened. Now, I didn't know that she was politicalized. I didn't know that she and Jason Epstein, who obviously was by then a political figure, were about to get married. So I just said the wrong thing to the wrong person. So now they have become, as you probably know, the most influential pair in our literary establishment. So that through the Hellman crowd and the Epstein crowd and all the other little gangs around, it's very easy to establish a silent treatment on a Meyer Levin. Now, not only does this pair own the New York Review of Books and edit it with Mr. Silvers, but they bought about a year and a half ago, and this is how control and manipulation works, they bought a thing called the Kirkus Review. If any of you know the book field, the Kirkus Review is a little preview sheet that goes out to the trade. 3 months before anything else is published about a book, you'll find a review, a preview in the Kirkus Review, and that can set the tone. It can do a lot of damage, it can do a lot of good. The Kirkus Review goes to book dealers, so they order their first lot of a book from it or don't order. It goes to book review editors. It goes to everybody in the trade, all the publishers. Of course, the Kirkus Review on The Settlers was murderous. So that this is how this manipulation takes place. Now, interestingly enough, the circle closed a few months ago on this particular instance of the diary and what has flowed from it, when there was an article, because they are now glamour people in the literary world. There was an article about the Epsteins in the New York Review of Books in the New York Times Magazine. In this article, Barbara, of course, in the interview, took credit for having discovered the diary and made it against the opposition of all the Doubleday brass and so on. Well, you know, it amused me. All right, she's still taking credit for what she didn't do. But there comes a letter the following week or two from a man who says, look, Barbara can make her career on this as long as she can, but the fact is that I was the Doubleday representative in Paris. I bought the diary for Doubleday from Otto Frank. Before she ever heard of it, I put it through, and so on and so on. And he added it was a review by Meyer Levin that made it a bestseller. Okay. I felt there was something behind this, and I called this man up. Well, he told me, this may sound, he evidently had his little dagger in his back from the Epsteins as well, because he said, you know, I hope you don't mind my saying this as a Gentile, but some Jews are the worst anti-Semites, and that pair were known around the Doubleday office as such Jews. Now he said, as far as your play is concerned, when Mr. Frank came back from New York in '52 in fall after your play had been put aside, I asked him what happened with Meyer Levin's play. Now, this was just after Frank had pleaded with me to give up my rights because all the experts from Lillian Hellman on and Clark Kermit Bloomgarden said it was an unactable play. To this man, Mr. Frank said, we couldn't do Meyer Levin's play because they said it was too Jewish. Close the circle. That was it the whole time, as I suspected. Now I have it in writing from this man. And this is one of the factors, if you are a Jewish writer in America, that you have to contend with the whole time, that unbeknownst to the public and the Jewish public, there is a projection here through the anti-Israel and anti-Jewish continuum factor, many of them Jews, of this radical universalist, in quotes, idea that Jewish identity must be sacrificed and dissolved away in favor of the world revolution. Now, why only Jews? No one has ever been able ideologically to discover. Other groups like the Arabs and so on must be stimulated to recover their national identity. But Jews must make this great sacrifice, and this began way back in the 1890s in their theology. Jews must give it up and be like Trotsky. Okay, I'm a great admirer of Trotsky's. As a matter of fact, I just read a book in which in his very last year, it turns out he was visited by one Bebe Edelson, a member of the Israel Knesset now, an old pioneer settler like the people in my book, The Settlers. And she recounted to the author of this book a wonderful full-day session with Trotsky in which, in his mellowing last years, he was extremely interested in life in Palestine and Israel, extremely curious about the kibbutzim and the extent of socialism there, and warm about his Jewish self. So that there was hope even for the Epsteins, I guess. But we must realize that the situation here for the really Jewish writer is not an open one, that we are constantly under surveillance and attack, when necessary, in subterranean ways by the extreme left, which for reasons of doctrine, policy, ideology, happens to be against us. Now, I am usually asked, well, if that's so, what about all the other Jewish writers? Why do you claim to be the only victim? I will just touch on it. I'll go into it further next time because we don't have time. One reason, of course, is that I have the longest active connection with Palestine and with the Jewish scene and with what is called a positive view of it. Let's take Malamud, the nearest to a warm connection, but he has never even taken a stand on Israel, and none of his writings express any contact with the current living problems of the Jewish community as such today. Of course, his last book does touch on the Jewish Negro theme, but in a very, very special way, which doesn't tell us much. Bellow, I consider him a very assimilationist, negative writer. They're certainly not going to turn on him when he is a graduate of the Partisan Review and one of them. Roth, the same thing. Singer, a foreign writer. Nothing that he writes really relates to the conflicts in our life today, nor even Potok. So that when you go over the whole range of writers who are at least familiar as writers who are Jews, whether they are American Jewish writers, or what we'll have to talk about later, it does happen that I kind of stick in their craw. And of course, as I said in my ad, the one really basic reason for the continued underground attacks on me is that I fought back. If you fight back, you have to expect the fight. And so I particularly have realized myself as a Jewish writer, I think now, more than anything else, because in a sense, after having found my own way to our own culture and become more specialized in it than the American culture or the English literary tradition, I feel that I now write more in the vein of, or in continuity with a Shalom Aleichem, even a Shalom Ash, than with Henry James. Having found my way, or even a Dreiser, who influenced me much earlier. Having found my way to that, I am in addition now pushed into that area by the opposition. So there I stand. Thank you. Yes? Wiesel also, you see, is not considered to them an ideological threat because he is mystical. And so they consider, okay, let him write about mysticism. Also, he's an untouchable because he is a survivor of the camps. So there's no conflict for them in regard to him. Other questions? Yeah? I didn't get it. Commentary has had a very special silence on me since Mr. Podores took over. I don't know why. I used to be a frequent contributor. In fact, I brought the Diary of Anne Frank to be serialized in commentary, and I wrote articles myself and short stories. But since he took over, I am on the next list. That's, I think, a personal matter of his taste. He doesn't like my writing. I don't put everything down to the political cause. Yeah. The Fanatic was a parallel to the case of the Anne Frank diary, very closely parallel. Yeah.
Just curious how the book is doing in this country and in Israel.
The Settlers? Well, it's not been published yet in Israel. It's being translated. In this country, it did, as far as the publisher was concerned, he didn't want me to publish this ad. Was strongly opposed to it. He said, look, it's a success. What are you trying to make out that there's a silence about it? So we sold, I think it's between 50 and 60,000 copies, which is a success, but it's not a sweeping success. This book, I think, had the potential of 2 or 3 times that sale if it had been properly presented. Also, we did receive a very high price for the paperback rights. And I suppose they'll put on a big paperback campaign, and at that point, the silence no longer matters in distribution of a paperback. It's commercial noise rather than literary. But I feel very deeply that even though financially I have no complaints about the book, I could have used more money, of course, but I feel very deeply that this is a kind of McCarthyism of their own that they have imposed on me, and that it must be fought on principle, and that is what I'm engaged in. Yeah.
Does anybody else share your viewpoint that the McCarthyism or that you're subject to extraordinary consideration on the negative side? Anything else?
Oh yes, there are many of my contemporaries who agree that I am getting this treatment, who are aware of it. And as a matter of fact, in the long struggle that I've had over trying to get the diary in my version released for production, I have had petitions signed by Elie Wiesel, Norman Mailer, Bruno Bettelheim, even French prominent authors. There is rarely anyone to whom I present it who refuses to sign it as a pure matter of principle. But to conduct this kind of a campaign, it's a one-man fight. And of course, they've tagged me as obsessed and paranoid and all the rest of it. In Russia, I would have been simply sent to an insane asylum without all this. But this is a very, very difficult matter. But through the years, I have managed First of all, I did go to court with it, and I proved to a jury that even their Broadway play was half plagiarized from mine. That stands as a verdict. Then we finally got it produced in Israel by the Soldiers Theater, and we got a set of reviews, all of which said this is better than the Broadway play as theater, as literature, as faithfulness, everything. So that the charge of its being unactable was erased. Nevertheless, in each instance, in Israel, they came over, and by legalistic pressures and means, they got the play shut up after its 50th performance, and we had to cancel performances in various kibbutzim and schools and so on. That still remained to be done. They threatened the kibbutz that put it on in memory of some fallen comrades. They wanted to do my version, and they did it despite a 2-page long cable that came from the lawyers here saying you're not allowed to put this on. Brandeis University put it on. 6 or 7 temples have staged it without asking for permission. But when they ask for permission, of course, they are refused. And usually, out of those, if it's been presented 7 or 8 times, there must be 80 or 90 requests for presentation that were rebuffed, and where the people didn't have the nerve just to go ahead.
You're talking about the difficulties with your play. You know, I'm more pointed towards the difficulties with your book. Who else joined you in that area?
Who else what?
Joined you in that area or supported you in that area with your book?
I have not asked individuals to protest on the settlers because I don't want to expose them. You now get into an area where if you ask writers to do it, they are risking their own careers, and very few of them will go that far. In the case of the Diary of Anne Frank, it wasn't that way. If you ask whether people agree that it's true that I'm getting the silent treatment, virtually every writer I've talked to or everyone in the book field says, yes, sure, it's obvious. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
These magazines take ads for the settlers?
I don't have enough money to counter all their silence with ads. No, they haven't had ads in magazines, but that is not the usual procedure on, if you've got an enormous bestseller, it reaches to advertising in the magazines, but reviews in magazines are not dependent on that. No, this is obviously a shutout by word being passed around. If you can't accept accumulative evidence of that nature, then there is no evidence. I mean, you have to at some point say, well, there are too many things that fit the pattern here for us to say it's not so. And as I say, the very same pattern was described with the same words in the Orwell article and in Solzhenitsyn and in Brodsky. So it is a known pattern of operation, particularly in use by these left-oriented organizations. Now, I'm not anti-left. My whole career in writing has been on the left. I am not anti-Soviet Union. I'm anti-Soviet Union on the Jewish question, and on the question of repression of literature. But I am not against their economic system, and I was one of the first to live in a kibbutz. I'm an equalitarian. I think that any people is welcome and entitled to any economic form of life that they want. So that it is in addition unjust to pretend that I am some kind of a reactionary. What is at issue here is simply the Jewish cause and the cause of literary repression. Yeah.
I'm curious to know, having read only little about the Penn Writers Organization, to which and the Ruder Wright appealed for assistance. Now,
Yeah, I will tell you about. Okay, I had this thing through with the Penn, and it isn't through yet. The Penn is I would say, controlled organization from my experience and from the experience of others. I brought this thing up to the Penn Committee on not the present case, but the diary. Now I have a little petition, a generalized petition saying, without legal questions, without questions of comparative merit, we feel that an alternative version of the diary on the stage should be allowed to be presented simply in freedom of expression. This has been signed, as I said, by virtually the cream of our writers. And so I brought it up to Penn, of which I've been a member for 20 years, saying, well, I would like Penn to endorse this petition. It took a year to get an answer from the censorship committee, and then they said no. So I said, why no? This is in the Penn manifesto. Every form of repression we protest. This is a very clear case of repression. I couldn't get an answer. So finally said, well, all right, I would simply like to send my petition to my fellow members of Penn for them to sign individually if they want to. Would you do me the courtesy of letting me use our mailing list? I'm a member. The answer was no. And then for the first time, again, like the silence in the magazines, you know, Penn has a weekly cocktail party, which is one of the jokes about the literary world, the Penn parties. Well, you know, you go sometimes. At each party, they honor, you get a free drink if you're one of the 3 or 4 authors having a book out that week, and so your book is, you know, and you get a red carnation and 1 free drink. Not one book of mine up to now has been skipped at the Penn cocktail parties on Monday. The Settlers, no. Now, this kind of petty organizational revenge because I protested is just too much to take. But it shows you that there is a literary institutional control in this country. And that's what I'm talking about. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.